Posture, okay, or do you need me to sit a certain way? Hi, I'm Bob Stasio. I'm here with Bill Connors today. Welcome to our next edition of Dreamit Live. Thanks for jumping on. We're going to give everybody a couple minutes to get situated in the channel. While you're in, please give us your name, give us where you're coming from, put it in the comment section. During the talk, when we're going to be interviewing Bill today, you can put comments in the comment section and any questions you have. The format for today is we'll speak for about 20 or 30 minutes and give a lot of time for answering of your questions. So feel free to put it in there and we'll hit them at the end. Thanks. Give everybody a couple minutes to jump in. Thanks, Bill. I know we originally had one of your other co-founders on, Woody.
Yes.
So Bill's pinch hitting today, but
Woody has a wedding, so
a wedding.
had to fill
in. Not his own.
He's the best man, so
got to go to those.
got best man duties.
That's a tough one. Best man duties on a Wednesday. He's got
wedding's Friday. Wedding's Friday. He's got a big speech tomorrow and Friday. So.
Okay, yeah, no, we get it. Yeah. Weddings have become a big thing.
I know.
So many events you got to go to. But okay, everybody who's jumping in, give you a few more minutes for more people to join. Feel free to put your name, where you're coming from in the comment section. We'll give everybody else a couple more minutes to jump in the channel. And again, if you have any questions while we're talking about our topic today, put it in the comments channel. We'll answer it at the end. And today we're going to be talking about the complex problem of insider threats and what to do about them. About another minute remaining. Thanks for jumping in today. A little bit after lunch. Did you eat lunch yet, Bill?
I did not eat lunch yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. We should have provided it for you.
That's okay.
Next time.
More of a late lunch guy anyway.
I'm an early lunch guy. I ate at 11. That's what I like. Get it out of the way. But we're located in the wonderful One Penn Plaza, which has the Comcast food court. So
it's a great food court.
Yeah. And where's your off? And by the way, Bill and Formotiv are a Philadelphia area company, and you guys are pretty close to here, right?
Yeah, we're about 5 blocks away. I was debating whether or not to take an Uber or walk, just considering it's about 95 degrees out, but decided to walk.
Yeah, it's hot. It is hot today.
So we're close by.
You guys you're in Old City, right?
We are in right in Center City, so I'm sure you know where McGillen's is. We're right by McGillen's.
Okay.
Right off Broad Street.
Oh, good. Hey, not too far. Okay, just a couple more minutes. Everybody's jumping in. Please introduce yourself in the comment section. Tell us where you're coming from. If you have any questions while we're chatting, please throw them in there and we'll answer them at the end. Okay, just a couple more minutes. Okay. We'll go ahead and kick it off. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Bob Stasio. I'm the Managing Director for Securetech at Dreamit Ventures. With us today, we have Bill Connors, who's one of the co-founders of the company Formotiv. And Formotiv was one of our startups that was in our last cohort, our last Securetech cohort for Dreamit. I'm sure everybody's familiar with Dreamit at this point, so I won't go into what we do, but they did very excellently in our last cohort. Got a lot of great company intros, and they're actually going to be joining us again on our investor sprint next cycle to raise. So what we want to talk about today is the complex problem of insider threats. And I think it's one of the most interesting problems in the security world. And kind of what made me think about this topic for today, there's been a couple of stories in the news that percolated up regarding insider threat and insider fraud. And two very, very different use cases. One recently went a little bit under the radar, was an announcement by the FBI on an indictment of a Chinese couple that was living in the United States, I believe in Ohio, that were employed at a medical tech company for 10 years, that were stealing data, stealing a very important intellectual property information from that company and sending it back to China. So a real insider threat espionage. And I thought what was really interesting about that case was that they existed and were in that company for 10 years without being detected. You know, a lot of times we think of security today as being fairly mature in organizations. They have a lot of ways to detect threats. You would think that there would be one little cookie crumb left behind by this threat over 10 years, but they remained undetected for that period of time until I believe they were taken down by law enforcement, by the FBI. Another one that came up was the case of Tesla. And in Tesla, we had, and this had been going on for a little while, but I believe there was just a verdict reached on it, where there was an insider threat employee who was a bit of a disgruntled employee and tried to hack onto some of the servers at the company to get, take out and steal information regarding self-driving technology at Tesla and release it to third parties. But also they were a disgruntled employee and tried to sabotage some of the data too. So it's kind of a dual use of theft and sabotage as well. So there's a bit of fraud and a bit of malicious activity going on. So you could just get a flavor of an understanding of the real threat which is caused by these insider issues, be it taking down the whole company's intellectual property, the foundation of what the company is all about, to malicious insider activity. We have a disgruntled employee. One little issue can cause a lot of havoc. So that made me think of this as a great topic to discuss today, and I'd like to introduce Bill to talk a little bit more about his company, Formotiv, and how they tackle that problem.
Yep, so I'm Bill Connors, co-founder of Formotiv, and we're a behavioral analytics technology that works with financial services, insurance, and technology companies for two key reasons. The first is help optimize their agent, employee, and customer experience, but what we're going to talk about today is around fraud and risk and reducing that, particularly with insider threats. I think, Bob, the thing that makes those two things so challenging is when you think about how employers protect themselves today, they're all operating under the assumption that their employees are going to act in good faith, right? And of course, as they should. And if you think about where the investment is today from a venture, from a private equity, from a vendor standpoint, it's really around protecting the perimeter. Right, in the physical space, right, you have buildings, you have security cameras, you have security systems, you have security guards. In the cyberspace, you have a firewall, you have IP whitelisting, you have authentication tools, you have two-factor, you have a lot of different tools at your disposal, again, to protect the perimeter. But what we always find and what we think is such a unique challenge, and it's represented by the two examples that Bob gave, is what happens when someone gets inside. Because of course these employees are going to pass those types of authentication measures with flying colors, and it makes it a really tricky challenge for enterprise organizations to protect their IP, protect their trade secrets, and protect their dollars ultimately.
Yeah, thanks for the intro. So got a couple questions here I wanted to go over, and by the way, as we're going through these, if anybody in the audience has questions, please put in the comments and we'll get to it at the end. We'll read them off at the end and go through them. Always love to make it interactive. So one of the things I wanted to ask you is, okay, we know a little bit about what the insiders are doing, but why? Why are they doing this? What are they targeting in the organization? Like, what are some of the things that they are trying to go after? What's their reasoning for doing this, and what's kind of the incentive for them to break the law in most cases to go after and risk everything to gain this information?
Yeah, risk, right? Their personal reputation, right? Jail time, of course. Yeah. We always like to take the philosophy of follow the money, right? So you're looking at embezzlement, wire transactions, IP and trade secrets, commissions for sales reps. So think about an insurance agent who operates and is paid solely on commission, right? And in life insurance, sometimes they make 125% of year one premium, right? Of course, they're going to manipulate, filter applications to push them through underwriting to ultimately support a family. So our philosophy always when working with insurance carriers, when working with banks and financial institutions is let's start with your most valuable assets, which obviously are your money, your trade secrets and IP, and your data. Are really the three.
And I think you alluded to, creating false applications, having that incentive. I believe, was it Wells Fargo?
Exactly.
Was that one case where they created fake applications or fake accounts, and they were doing some manipulation in order to try to get, meet a quota, right?
And I did some research on that example, and you talk about reputational risk, right? Wells Fargo was a $300 or so billion company, right? Market cap. They lost 12% of their value in a week. Jeez. They were fined well into the 9 figures. And that excludes the reputational risk, right? If all things were equal and me as a consumer had the choice between JP Morgan and Wells Fargo, because of that scandal and that incident, most customers, you would think, would choose JP Morgan.
Yeah, no, it's a great example. And let's just look at that for 1 second. In that example, I believe in Wells Fargo, there was kind of a few people doing this. It was a group, and I think they were pressured by some leadership, so that other issues. But in that case, when they're doing these things and they're doing this malicious activity, what are the little indicators that you're looking for? What are the data points you're trying to pull out to try to determine if you can detect an alert to this type of activity?
Yeah, we usually always think about abnormalities, right? So take that Wells Fargo example, right? 90% of their applications come through during the workday, right? Between 9 and 5, right? A lot of certain applications might happen after hours, right? And why is that abnormal? Or why is a particular rep who usually, say, closes 10 new clients a day, just to use simple numbers, is suddenly closing 15, right? So what we like to always take a stance on is let's baseline whatever the data set is, and then let's use machine learning and detection on top of it to figure out where abnormalities happen, because that typically is where the trouble is.
Cool. So like deviations from a norm.
Exactly.
So let's talk about the different types of insiders. I think one of the interesting aspects about this field is people think of insiders as a monolith, right? Just a bad insider in there doing a lot of activity trying to take down an organization. Not necessarily the case, especially when you're deploying a technology to try to find insiders. You often find a lot of different flavors, a lot of different types of them, which you have to respond to them in different ways. And I've done a lot of insider investigations in the past, and they're all very different. Everybody has different motivations. Do you have any kind of categories or broad ways you would bracket the insiders and the types that you look at?
Yeah, I think the first would be around negligence, right? And a lot of times that's not malicious. It's just someone who doesn't follow processes, right? A really simple example is the lone wolf sales guy at an organization, right, who never uses Salesforce, right? It's obviously a little bit different of an example, but it's someone who internally just doesn't follow processes, right? That could be not signing a visitor into a building, right? It'd be as simple as that, and just walking them in and taking them through and not taking appropriate measures. So that's one. I think the other really big example, especially as businesses outsource most of their technology stack now, is with third parties and vendors, right? And that's why at big organizations, a vendor management and a compliance team is hundreds, thousands of people, because think about the amount of risk that they're taking. The Capital One example that happened a few months ago, right? That was an AWS engineer who got a lot of, who pulled all that personal data. So managing third-party vendors and third-party risks, right, whether it be a consultant or a technology provider, is a really key issue. And us as startups know going through a vendor management and procurement process isn't a whole lot of fun, just given the amount of questionnaires and the amount of due diligence you have to go through, but it's obviously warranted.
And I think and kind of the worst type of insider to me is what I call like a true insider or malicious insider, that somebody that has a bone to pick with the organization, they're an employee that may have been fired that is trying to get back at the company. That's one category, I believe. And then there's probably the worst category, which is an espionage type insider, which unfortunately we've seen a lot of cases, especially against the United States, from foreign countries. And they tend to have a lot of capability, right? I mean, have you run into that in any of the work that you guys have done?
So we have not done a ton of government work yet. It's something that we're working on. We're really focused actually around entitlements, budgets, and who wins contracts, right? Because obviously there's a lot of influence internally for that, and obviously embezzlement. I mean, you always read stories about state and local governments of the secretary who embezzles $150,000 to herself and her family. So that's really where our focus has been, and we're currently pursuing a lot of opportunities specifically around government housing, food stamps, those types of things.
Great. And by the way, just a little break. If you guys are just joining, make sure to log your name and where you're coming from in the comments. And if you have any questions, please put them in the comments as well, and we'll get to it at the end of our conversation. So just to kind of shift gears here for a second, just to bring it up a level, why do you think insiders are so tough to catch? Like, what makes them so difficult? Why do we still have all these issues, even though we spend millions and billions of dollars in cybersecurity as a country? Why are they still so difficult to catch?
I think the first is that they're assumed to be authenticated, right? And they're assumed to be operating with the right intentions, right? Which obviously makes things difficult, right? Because it's not the group that's necessarily sitting behind a computer and committing crime for as a job. It's more so someone who works at an organization and slowly flips. And I think that takes it to the next thing, whereas usually a slow leakage, right? If I'm going to wire transfer money or embezzle money to myself, I'm probably not going to do a $5 million transaction, right? That would set compliance off. It's usually a slow drip of smaller transactions, which makes it a really, really difficult problem and challenge to solve internally.
Yeah, that's a good point. This comes up a lot too. Came up in a lot of intelligence work I've done in the past, where you would find a way to detect the adversary, and there would be a concern that the adversary would kind of figure out what you're looking for, right? So, for example, one of the things I used to do at a previous job was look at anybody who was uploading a file to their personal email account above 5 megabytes. Well, what did people do when they found out that it was above 5 megabytes? They did it just below, right? So and when you make a money transfer, if it's above $10,000, it's flagged. There's always a bit of a cat and mouse game, and I tend to think that people always tend to make mistakes when they commit crimes or do something bad, and you'll always find them. But can you talk to that a little bit? And you guys have a very unique approach of how you do things, where you actually combat that fact, right? There's not just a particular static thing you're looking at. So talk about how you can dynamically change what you're looking for to compete against those type of measures when the bad guys figure out what you're looking at.
Yeah, and I think what makes it really tough is when you talk about insider threats, it's the people who know the processes best, right? They know all the rules.
They do not.
Right? They know all the rules. So I think the best way to approach that is to use machine learning, right? Look at different data sets and constantly analyze and baseline what fraud, right? What behaviors of employees or transactions of employees ultimately are high risk. So, right, your example of the 5 megabits, if we start to see things trend towards 4.99 megabits, right, then what we're looking for should change, right? And obviously having to go in and change those rules by yourself is a challenge. So that's where you need technology who essentially recreates rules in real time, as fraudsters, right, or as insider threats continue to change their behaviors.
And actually, a very relevant example, personal story to that $10,000 mark. When I used to be in the military, and my unit was coming back from Iraq, one of the people in our unit, is a public story now, you could go look it up. He was in charge of working with the community in Iraq, and he would hand out money and distribute money to the local people. Well, turns out during our whole deployment, he was sending money back home in boxes, like literally $1 million worth of cash. And when we got back from our deployment, he went to banks and he started to open bank accounts and do initial deposits. Well, he thought that he was being very smart and doing deposits that were just under $10,000. He did like $9,500. But it turns out if you do just under the amount but do it 100 times, you get flagged, right? So I forget what authority was flagged. Maybe it was the Secret Service, maybe it was the FBI. But he eventually got flagged, and he got caught, and he may still be in jail, but he did get convicted, and of doing that. And that was a pretty massive fraud, right? That was going on for a large period of time. So there are ways to kind of play that cat and mouse game and look. But that's just one example from my past. Yeah, and I was going to ask you too. Do you have any examples you can give us, maybe, of companies you've worked with, anonymized, of course, of use cases where you've discovered some fraud that was going on in the organization that nobody knew about?
Yeah, so I'll give you two examples. So one is with an insurance carrier, and what their agents were doing was, I get to the end of an auto application, right, and I need to send it to Bob for e-signature as the customer. What that agent was actually doing was they were creating Gmail accounts or Yahoo accounts, sending the application that I should send to Bob to myself, and e-signing on behalf of Bob, right, in order to, again, hit quota, make commissions. Another great example is in telecom. And what we saw was with their sales force in B2B setting, they had a bunch of sales reps who at the end of the quarter wanted to hit quota, so they would run a ton of applications through for their family and friends. They'd hit quota, and then as soon as it was time to ship the product or implement for the client, they would cancel the orders, right? So really, two really interesting cases of not necessarily, right, espionage, of course, but costing these organizations millions of dollars, because if I write a bad insurance policy, I write a bad life insurance policy, right, or a bad auto insurance policy, I could lose millions of dollars on one of them. And in the telecom space, having to hunt down all these employees, fire employees, rehire employees, right, again, these indirect benefits or these indirect negative repercussions are massive, even though you can't necessarily put an exact dollar amount on them.
And it seems like when you work with organizations, you come up with use cases all the time. It seems like they're pretty varied in how they go about it. Is that true when you work with companies?
Yeah, I think one use case that we're actually working on right now is in the on-demand economy, right, with drivers or delivery people.
Oh yeah, you were telling me about
right?
that. Yeah.
Because what's unique about that is 90% of the drivers who submit an application end up not driving, but there's a ton of driver fraud where they will leave their app on, right? They'll say they picked up an order and delivered it even though they didn't, right? There's devices that they flag, so they sign up from a friend's phone, right? So you don't realize the level of insider fraud across different applications and across different industries, but that's one that we just sort of stumbled upon.
Never knew about, yeah.
Exactly, we stumbled upon it like 3 months ago.
And and driver fraud, when they're picking, they're saying they're doing something but they're not. Like, what's the impact of a single person? Are they trying to make an extra $300 a day, or are they, what's kind of the scale of the impact there?
So so the scale of the impact is it usually impacts about 10% of drivers, regardless of the industry.
Really? Wow.
And what's unique is at the end of the day, those are customer businesses. Everyone goes to on-demand companies because of convenience and ease.
Yeah.
Right. And if a driver says that my order was delivered and it wasn't, and it never shows up, guess what? I'm not going to use that service anymore.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm going to switch to
Only
a competitor.
takes a few times. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's that we've seen with that industry. It's a race to the bottom. Right. Best price wins and best experience wins, and those are the repercussions is directly on the customer.
Oh wow, interesting. Great. So, and just last question before we get to your questions, and if you still hadn't had the chance to put questions in comments, go do that now if you're listening. We'll get to them in a minute. But what do you think companies can do right now to start thinking about these types of insider threat and insider fraud? If somebody's watching this and they're concerned about it in their organization, like what are the first steps they can take to get on that journey, outside of just going out and buying Formotiv, right? But what do they need to start thinking about in order to just kind of getting a program set up?
So I think conceptually, right, if we're just speaking at a high level, I think the first thing that they need to do is actually look, right? We go to conferences all the time, and you won't believe this, but we talk to a bank or an insurance carrier, and we say, hey, this is what we do, right? We anonymously monitor employees, agents, call center reps for instances of fraud, and they look at us like we have 10 heads and say, what do you mean my employees and my agents don't commit fraud? So I think conceptually at the highest level is I think a lot of organizations are turning a blind eye to this, and there needs to be more proactive monitoring, and at least taking a peek and a look as to how employees
take an audit,
exactly,
small audit data sample.
Exactly, and getting proactive around the data and starting to look at it and invest time and effort into it. And
it's probably something fairly simple, right? It's just if in the case you made of the insurance agents opening up their own, or getting an email account, a fake email account to open up something in the Wells Fargo case, they can just do a sample of 10 a day of people and see, just looking at weird activity that people that in the organization and in the industry would know immediately is wrong. You're seeing it's wrong because you have a AI software that's looking at it, and it's looking agnostically at everything. But if I was in the insurance industry and I was a supervisor, I would probably know that nobody's making an insurance application at 9 o'clock at night or 10 o'clock at night, right? That would flag for me. So that might be a good way for them to know that there is stuff going on in their organization.
And look at Wells Fargo. I mean, they ran over 2 million applications through, right? And that wasn't flagged. So just simply, I think it was 1.5 million credit cards and 500,000 debit cards, or vice versa, right? But just looking at that example, how do you not know? And it's a lot of times there's nothing in place to even take a look as to what is abnormal about this activity all of a sudden that I'm seeing.
Yeah. Sometimes people in this industry, and we've worked in security for a long time, we have a very cynical view on things, and you always assume somebody's doing something wrong. You assume the worst. You assume a breach. You assume something's happening, but a lot of people don't think that way, right? So if you're in those particular businesses and you think everything's hunky-dory, you may want to just take a peek, take a look, take an audit. That's probably.
And I think what makes it such
idea.
a challenge too is you have the customer and employee experience team who wants no friction, ease, right, as little steps as possible, and then you have the security and fraud teams, right, and compliance teams who want as much friction. So how do you marry those two things? It's a really difficult problem to solve.
I always think there's a key balance between security and usability. So. Great. Okay, so we're going to transition to doing a few questions. By the way, if you still haven't put your questions in there, go ahead and do so in the comment section of the feed. We have a few in here, so I'll go over the first one. So we have a question. It's how big does my organization have to be to worry about insider threats? And maybe you want to comment about what an organization, a company needs to look like to think about it. Is it a 15-person law firm, or does it have to be a company the size of Wells Fargo? Like, who should be concerned about it?
Yeah, so we've talked about the big ones, so we'll talk about some smaller ones, right? How many times do you read in the news of an employee, a secretary, right, someone in finance embezzling money?
Okay.
Right, you see that in local government all the time. So our belief is, right, and we're not necessarily targeting small customers, so I'm certainly not biased. Is you have to look at it no matter how big your organization is, right? We see in the news all the time, local government workers who are embezzling money to themselves. So it's something that we see frequently, regardless of the size of the business.
Okay. Next question. Could hackers use social engineering schemes and techniques to mislead company insiders? Like, are there ways that you could be what I guess you would call an unwitting insider, right? So you think you're doing. I used to do this. I used to do penetration tests, right? And one of the techniques I would use is I would call the front desk. I would call the receptionist at the front desk and say, I'm so-and-so, and I'm trying to give a report to the board, and I'm sending an email through, and it's not getting through. I think your firewall is hitting it. Can you just download the attachment for me and click on it? Thanks so much. So you would actually literally walk them through being an insider, an unwitting insider. Like, have you seen that? Like, what do you think the true impact of that is?
So the impact of the example that you gave is obviously enormous, right? If there's a security breach and someone who nefariously gets into a network. So, we have to do it all the time, or we have to fill out secure email. We have to whitelist our email IPs, our computer IPs. As far as getting access, I think the biggest way to combat that is obviously with all the tools on the periphery that we talked about around authentication, but the other is having great processes in place, right? So the person answering the phone knows how to handle these types of scenarios because, it's, of course, someone would do that, and it makes a lot of sense, right? Go to an employee who isn't suspicious at all to open up an attachment and gain access to a network. So I think it comes from continuing to invest in the perimeter and then also putting compliance and a great procurement team in place to have proper procedures.
Okay, and next question. Have you ever seen an insider aid external cybercrime? So somebody that was, you talked about a couple of insider cases that was somebody from their own volition doing it because they were trying to meet a quota, right? So it's kind of working internally. I guess, maybe the question is have you ever seen like a wider conspiracy that has tentacles outside the organization, or even have you thought about looking for things like that?
So specifically at our business, I have not, but I've,
probably
obviously
more rare,
right? More rare, but a great one. I'm actually reading the book, $1 Billion Whale, right now.
Okay.
Right, and that's about the Malaysian Sovereign Wealth Fund, where a 27, 28-year-old guy got really close to the prime minister and his wife.
Wow.
They raised $7 billion. Right, then you had Goldman Sachs introduced to the process with a few rogue employees in Asia who were bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars in fees.
Gave it legitimacy.
Exactly, gave it legitimacy, and this guy gained access to the right people, influenced the right people, and ultimately, was funding $20 million parties for himself in Las Vegas, right? So it's not the perfect example, but of course, influencing people with the dollars, influencing the right people of an organization has a massive, massive impact.
Yeah, it's good point. I think, I've done a lot of investigations where it's easy to tell. It's a lot easier to find like one single person doing something bad, right? It can be fairly obvious. Or if you're just starting out doing investigating, it's pretty simple. But once you have to connect the dots into a wider organization, and when it gets like second and third order tiers outside of that, like you mentioned, it becomes really complex really quickly. And there's a lot of different ways people are communicating and things like that.
Yeah,
So,
that one in particular, he's talking to Swiss banks,
amazing,
right? And there's people inside to make sure that he can wire money properly, all these different things, and that the tentacles, to your point, just spread throughout in order to ship money all around the world without raising any red flags.
Yeah, I think I've had some history with doing intelligence work where we first started off looking at people doing improvised explosive device cells in Iraq, right? They were just a person putting a bomb on the street. It's pretty easy to figure out who was doing that, but then it took my team about a year or so to really get good to figure out all those tentacles, like who was recruiting that team, who was funding that team, who was bringing the devices in, who was bringing the supplies, who outside of the country was funding it, who was motivated from a political interest, and it took almost a year to really figure that out. So it's really interesting. Cool. We have another question coming in from LinkedIn from Sai. His question is, if the product uses machine learning, how are you combating for AI biases during anomaly detection?
Yep, so very good question. I'll answer that in two parts. So first is in our particular case, right, we pull outcomes and use supervised machine learning, right? So we'll work with a vendor, and over time they'll pass us specific instances of fraud that then we're able to run against our data set to see how predictive it is in predicting that outcome. So that helps around biases. We always get questions around, well, what if somebody was working late, or someone got up to get a glass of water and that's why they took long. And our philosophy there, and we actually worked with Bob and his team around sort of how to market and talk about this, but that's dynamic security, right? So our belief is we're not necessarily a neural network black box type of solution. We don't believe in saying, yes, this is fraud, or no, this isn't. We believe in saying, hey, this is suspicious. Let's add more friction to the process, right? So we see an abnormal credit card transaction come through. Instead of saying, hey, let's block this, right? How about let's send a text message to their phone so that they can deliberately approve it. So I would say the two ways to answer your question is first using outcomes, and then second is using this concept of dynamic security to never say yes or never say no, that it's definitely fraud or not.
Okay, good answer. It's probably time for a few more questions. If you guys have questions out there, please make sure you get them into the comment section. We'll do a couple more. So when you're implementing this type of program, insider threat, insider fraud program, about how long does it take? Like, what is it, a year? Is it a month? What's the process of doing that?
Yeah, so for us, right, because we're using a lot of math and statistics, it does take some time for the data to converge. So depending on the amount of activity we get, it can be as short as 30 days. As far as being able to find things that are meaningful from it. Our longest has been 6 months. I think the challenge and the time that it takes is really from operationalizing a program, right? So of course you can set a bunch of different tools in place that fire off a bunch of different alerts, but how do I actually do something with it, right? How are we, or any provider, not the company who throws out 50 different alerts for every transaction, figuring out what really matters and who to pass the alerts to and notify at the organization is really where the time occurs, and it's usually, I would say, anywhere from 3 to 6 months to nail that process down.
Great. Okay, a couple more questions coming in. We have a question from Prasad. I hope I'm saying your name right. He's asking, do you have any use cases in the pharma or healthcare industry? I know you've worked a lot with insurance, but medical insurance, insurance fraud. Have you worked in that industry at all?
So we are actually now working in the provider space around payments, right? Because of course providers are incented to provide as many services as billable services as they can, right? And then bill the payer based on the services that they provide. So one of the things that we're exploring with a partner is monitoring these applications or these forms that are filled out by doctors in order to be paid and reimbursed for the services that they provide. So that's one use case in healthcare. We're actively looking at pharma use cases. and would love to chat further if you have any thoughts, because it's certainly an industry that we're not experts in.
Certainly, hit him up on LinkedIn, Bill Connors.
I'll make sure I comment at you after we hang up here.
Yeah, well, I think everything gets logged in the comment section, so that's the cool thing about LinkedIn. Great. So probably just one last question for you before we go. That came in the section was, do you have any wins you want to talk about? You talked about some use cases you're deploying, and I'm sure you worked with the customers to set that up, and they have a pain point, but after your system has been deployed, have you had any wins that you can talk about it as anonymous as you can? But what have you done so far with the company?
Yeah, so I'll speak to a life insurance win that we have. So one of our carriers that we work with actually has what they call a collaborative application. The agent starts it. They send the medical questions, right? The do you use tobacco? Do you exercise? How much do you weigh? What medications do you take? Questions to the consumer. Then it gets sent back to the agent. The agent completes it and presses submit and ultimately completes the policy. What we've been able to detect is instances, and it happens more frequently than you think, up to 72% of the time with one carrier is where a consumer answers those questions a certain way, and say the agent receives the app and doesn't love how the consumer answered the questions, they'll actually go back and change them. So what we're able to do is alert the carrier of these types of behaviors, and we've seen up to 72% of the time where the agent actually does that and corrects information that the customer had provided.
Wow, very cool. And I lied, we have one more question come in. We'll answer because we have a little bit of time left. And this question's from Karthik, and I again hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Though CISOs say they are thinking about it, there's no urgency until something bad happens to them, which is true, right? You were saying everybody has their head in the sand until there's a big hair on fire emergency like Wells Fargo, especially in the insider threat space. I would agree with that. How do you educate the business that this matters to them and that compel them to take action?
Yeah, so I think we're certainly trying hard to compel them to take action.
That's your job.
Right, that's our job, that's our sales cycle. What makes this a little bit of a challenging sale is it hasn't happened to everyone, and even if it has, they don't necessarily know about it. So we're always walking in the door, educating them, and also saying, hey, let's be proactive here. In some cases, for our particular use case, we'll say, hey, turn it on, and until we actually do something with the data, we'll charge a reduced fee.
Sure.
Right? So we'll get to that point just given our size of, hey, we'll do something for a reduced fee, and then once we start analyzing and using it, we'll start to charge a premium on top of that. So we really, at our stage, have to get creative around educating a CISO, because the last thing someone wants to hear as a chief information security officer is, hey, you're not doing your job. Right? So it's certainly always a challenge for us. Yeah, and just to comment on that too, so I've worked in an industry which has a similar problem, which is kind of the field of threat hunting, which is kind of looking for advanced persistent threats or advanced threats that exist on the network that are so good they're kind of sleeping on the network and staying there and can exist for years without you knowing about. So to your point, there's not a giant alert telling you need to look at this. It's a low and slow attack, and convincing people they need to look at it. And I think to look at it from the vendor side and how to help out and how to help a CISO and empathize what they're dealing with is these CISOs are dealing with 40 different or 80 different tools from 40 different vendors, right? There's so much coming in. They don't really have a lot of time to take risk on something that's not going to work. So you need to prove your value and show your worth very quickly with a limited data set. So doing something where you could say, hey, plug me in for 2 minutes. It's super easy to deploy, or give me we used to say to customers, give us just 10,000 lines of data and we'll show you what we can do. And that's what I really like about your company too, why we recruited them, was you have a super fast deployment. It's just a tiny little snippet of, I believe it's JavaScript, that you can plug onto a website to start to track some of these movements, which is, again, super easy deployment, low friction, showing the value really quickly. You can prove there is something there. There is something they should look at. Show them, don't tell them. I think is the best way, and that's what I've been successful with. So, I think that wraps us up for today. Any other parting shots or plugs you want to do to the crowd? No, that's it. Feel free to reach out to myself or another member of our team if you have any questions, thoughts, or would like to connect. Would love to chat and appreciate the time, Bob. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for coming by. And
You can leave your comments in the LinkedIn section. I believe I'll be linked there. You could also follow me on Twitter at Bob Stasio or at Dreamit. Thanks, and see you next time.